Most of us deeply desire to lead intentional lives. We want to hear God's voice and follow His leading. But there are often so many confusing voices and distractions in this world that it's hard to hear God's still small voice. The spiritual discipline of Examen is the practice of prayerfully reviewing our lives. Not an examination or assessment of our lives, as if we're trying to measure up to our life's goals. Instead, the practice of Examen is simply noticing God's presence in our ordinary, everyday lives. It's how we dust for God's fingerprints or rummage for God. It's how we notice the patterns of our ordinary lives and ask God to speak through these patterns, to hear His leading. When we make this practice a rhythm, we begin to notice patterns of things that draw us towards God, traditionally called consolations, and things that draw us away from God, traditionally called desolations. For the believer who is seeking God, these subtle movements are clues of how God may be speaking to us and leading. When we notice things that draw us towards God, such as life-giving relationships or joyful experiences, we can trust that God is inviting us to press into these consolations. When, however, we find a pattern of hopelessness or brokenness that clearly draws us away from God, we can invite God to show us the best way to change direction in our lives. God is always present and active in our world. We simply need to take the time to notice and listen. The Examen is the spiritual practice of noticing God's presence in our lives. So how do we practice the Examen? This practice can be done on a daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly basis. It's a very good practice for when we are going through a season of transition. When we practice it on a daily basis, it takes as little as 10 minutes a day. So we begin with gratitude. We give thanks to God for the gifts that He has given us in our lives, and we come gently into God's presence. We remind ourselves that we are beloved of God and that God desires deeply to speak with us. We can live in God's grace, and we ask God to look on our day with His grace. Then we gently review our day. Together with God at our side, we think through the conversations, the relationships, the events and tasks of our day. We ask the Holy Spirit to bring to our mind those things that we need to notice. We don't need to catalog our day hour by hour. Simply trust that God will bring to mind those things that He wants us to notice. We may want to ask these questions of our day. When did I feel closest to God? When did I feel farthest away? When did I feel full of life? When did I feel life draining away? What am I most grateful for today? What am I least grateful for? When did I give and receive the most love today? The least love? As you reflect on your day, emotions may rise. Don't judge these emotions. Simply notice them. They are indicators of something that you need to listen to. If a memory convicts you of some shortcoming, simply ask God to forgive you. He will. And if some memory brings sadness to you, simply lean in closer to God for His healing. Then pray about what you notice. What might God be saying to you in these movements of your day? Invite God to help you discern His loving call in these movements. Practicing the Examen is a spiritual discipline that helps you notice the presence of God in your life. As you practice it, you may notice that there are a pattern of struggles in your life, in certain relationships or tasks or events. What might God be saying to you about these life-draining experiences, these desolations? Is God inviting you to consider a different way of being in these experiences? Is there an invitation to let go of something? You may also notice patterns of life and joy and peace in particular relationships or tasks or events. How can you move towards these consolations? Is there an invitation from God to lean into more of these kinds of life giving experiences? Reviewing your life on a daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly basis is an intentional way to listen to God's still, small voice and choose to move towards the life giving presence of God and be transformed.